to the weekend. The court losses are piling up for the Trump administration. In just the past week, the administration faced two big legal rebukes. On Thursday, a Trump-appointed federal judge from Texas barred the administration from using the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans it deemed to be criminals from the Southern District of Texas, claiming that the use of the statute by the White House was illegal. Then on Friday, another federal judge blocked Trump's executive order targeting law firm Perkins Coie, calling the president's efforts, quote, an unprecedented attack on the U.S. judicial system and, quote, unconstitutional. Joining me now are the co-hosts of the Main Justice podcast, Andrew Weissmann, former FBI General Counsel, and Mary McCord, former acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security. Andrew, Mary, welcome to the weekend. Mary, Trump keeps losing in court, but it seems like Trump keeps defying the courts and their decisions. I'm just wondering, at what point do we get to a true constitutional crisis? And I know we keep talking about that, but I'm sitting here, the Supreme Court said facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and yet he's still not back.
That's right. So, you know, this is the question so many of us are debating. And I will say that a month ago, my view was we weren't at a true crisis until you had outright defiance of a clear judicial ruling. The problem is what the Trump administration is doing is everything's a little squishy, right? They're trying to introduce ambiguity into terms like facilitate. They're trying to introduce ambiguity into Judge Boasberg's order, turn the planes around, right? And say, well, we were over international airspace by that point in time. And so they're not going into the judges and saying, we think your order is unlawful and we're not going to comply. Then we'd be at that complete loggerheads. And I think the courts, at least the Supreme Court, not so much the lower courts have clearly had it. They're being very clear. They feel like they're being lied to, and I think sometimes they are, not necessarily intentionally by the attorneys in front of them, but because the attorneys in front of them don't have the information they need to answer the judge's questions. But I think the Supreme Court has kind of allowed some of that squishiness by being less than crystal clear in its orders, and it's time for it. And I think partly that was intentional so that they could leave some time for the push-pull and hope that the administration would sort of do the right thing. But it's hard not to say we're not already in crisis point when I'm talking about it for, several minutes to try to explain the answer to that question.
Right.
Andrew, building on what Mary just said, all of these cases, the judges were following the law. And is this just going to inevitably end up at the Supreme Court? And what should we expect there?
I think some of them will definitely end up there. One thing to note about the judges, in spite of the administration saying these are activist judges, the judges who are ruling against the administration are from Democratic appointees, Republican appointees, you have Trump appointees, you have a unanimous Supreme Court decision saying that these people in El Salvador were entitled to due process and have to be given due process. So this is not
how can
activist.
they still defy it, though?
I'm a little bit more pessimistic in terms of what I think is going on. I totally agree with Mary that the Supreme Court has left some wiggle room. At the district court level, you were seeing defiance. You have judges who have had it, as Mary said. And the one area, though, just to answer your question about whether everything will end up in the Supreme Court, I think the orders where all judges have said the law firm orders, there are 4 executive orders that have all been struck down by the courts, left and right, so to speak. I don't think if the administration is smart, they're going to take that to the Supreme Court, because that will end us. I think they will lose. And right now they're doing pretty well on just the sort of fear factor and the terrorizing effect of the executive orders. Even though they keep on being struck down unanimously, every single court has said they're unconstitutional.
Mary, one of the things that's so interesting for us as reporters when we're talking to people is asking, okay, for folks in the administration, when are you guys going, when do you feel like we're in a constitutional crisis, right? Because that's also a question for them. How far are you willing to take this? Because I talked to people before we got into the administration on January 19th and 18th, folks that are now at the Justice Department, and they said, we're going to push everything. We're going to push the bounds of everything. We're going to push into all the lanes. And they know that they can do this because at the end of the day, the checks and balances seems a little broken. Well, is that not working out the way that the founders envisioned? Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court judges don't have an army. So what can be done if, as we've seen over and over and over again, the Trump administration, whether it be the lawyers in court or the actual administration, the folks in the White House, say, we're not doing that.
So this is
or we're not doing it your way.
That's right. So this is where I think we now see that our system has survived for 250 years because each of the branches had respect for the others. And
handshake agreements.
Yeah, it is an interesting way to put it. And they wanted the republic to survive. They wanted democracy to survive. And so that push-pull, right? You've seen many times sort of Congress and the executive go at it, and they do a little give and take, and they dance around, and they have some public statements, and then they kind of resolve things, right?
A lot of theater.
There's theater, but they resolve it without pushing us to this crisis point. And so I do think it is in many ways in the hands of the administration to make these decisions. Judges are going to keep ruling against them on the law in issues where they have clearly exceeded statutory authority, constitutional authority, violated judicial rulings, but they have the power to Andrew's point, they can decide not to appeal everything, right? There's one way to have certain things go away by saying, we're going to pick and choose battles. Now, so far, they've been basically appealing everything. They've been going, as aggressively as possible. But I also don't think they want to have a series of losses in the Supreme Court. And so they're trying to figure out, I think, right now, where the justices are. And at least when it comes to due process, all 9 justices say you've got to provide due process.
Andrew, I want to switch gears and talk about President Trump's battle with Harvard. He went to social media targeting Harvard's tax-exempt status. But yesterday, NBC has a story about how that threat against Harvard could create some problems for the IRS. He wrote on Friday, "We are going to be taking away Harvard's tax-exempt status. It's what they deserve." And yet there's a 1998 law that bars the president and any other government official from directing the IRS to investigate taxpayers. And as we have seen on so many things, the president and his administration couldn't care less about what the law says. So what is the overall goal here?
So first, I'm sure a lot of the viewers are thinking, well, I don't understand. If the president is violating the law, why isn't the attorney general doing something about it? And the answer, of course, is you put in somebody who is a loyalist, and they ignore the signal gate issue. They ignore this, which is that you're not supposed to have the president directing IRS attacks. I would like to remind people that this attack on Harvard follows the administration just like a minute ago saying, oh no, our attack on Harvard was a mistake. Now it's like, no, it wasn't a mistake. It's actually full on with the president directing this IRS investigation, saying, actually he's saying take away the status of Harvard being a nonprofit before there's actually an investigation. Usually you have an investigation, you see what the facts are, then you determine it. One thing is for sure, the statement by the president is going to end up in court. It is not a useful thing for the administration to have the president saying something that appears by all accounts to be against the law, that is saying that there is going to be sort of this sentence by the administration before there's the investigation. And this is a very, very good fact for Harvard.
Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson made a pretty extraordinary statement in Puerto Rico about Donald Trump and the rule of law. How surprising was that? And do you expect there to be as much of a split, the normal vote on the Supreme Court, or how do you see the votes going on some of these big cases?
It is unusual to have federal judges speaking out the way that you have seen, both sort of off the bench and even on the bench. You see judges, including very conservative judges, speaking out including Judge Wilkinson in the Fourth Circuit, with really strong language about the unconstitutionality of what's going on. It's a sign of where we are that they have really lost sort of the conservative jurists. They've lost the Wall Street Journal. They've lost Joe Rogan. I mean, that tells you just how extreme this is. And to Mary's point, it is really worth noting it was 9-0 in the Supreme Court. 9-0. The justices who people had thought there's no way they're anymore going to be sort of tethered to reality, sort of Justices Alito and Justice Thomas, which a lot of people thought are just always going to be ruling for Donald Trump. Nope, 9-0 that they violated due process. And so, the devil's going to be in the details as they get into further cases, but that tells you where we are as a country, that there's this kind of lawlessness going on. And to the point that we've all been talking about, this idea of what is going to happen when you actually have a confrontation with the Supreme Court saying, do it, and they say, make me.